Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And here's an album I've been looking forward to all year, the newest record from Ayreon, called The Source. And now it's time for the big one, folks. The record I've arguably been anticipating the most in 2017. The newest collaboration album from a musical genius and a veteran of progressive metal for the past 20 years. The sort of project that's pulled from dozens of acclaimed metal acts from symphonic and progressive metal and inspired at least 3 records that I would chalk as progressive metal stalwarts that you must hear, and one that's a genuine 10 out of 10 classic. And you all know who it is. Yep, folks, it's Ayreon, the project of Arjen van Lucasem, who I last discussed in detail when I talked about his side project, The Gentle Storm, in 2015. And before then, when I reviewed the Ayreon album, The Theory of Everything, back in 2013, which, for the record, nearly topped my list of my favorite albums of that year. Now, that record did turn out to be a little bit contentious among some Ayreon fans. The story felt distinctly separate from the Ayreon multiverse, the choice to structure the track listing in 4 mammoth songs, each extending over 20 minutes, and a narrative that might have been a tad too abstract and yet grounded in the real world for its own good, especially with the ambiguous ending. Now, I didn't care, but that might have been more because the narrative connected on a deeply emotional level for me that kind of short-circuited some of my critical analysis. I mean, a young man with a neurological condition and complicated relationship with his family finds new agency in a quest against a backdrop of theoretical physics. I mean, that hit a few too many close no's, at least for me personally. But that didn't mean that I was inherently skeptical going into The Source this time around. I mean, for one, look at this lineup. James LaBrie of Dream Theater, fresh off his own extended progressive metal epic The Astonishing last year. Tommy Karavik of Camelot. Tommy Rogers of Between the Buried and Me. Russell Allen of Symphony X. Floor Jansen of Nightwish. Hansi Kirsch of Blind Guardian. Mike Mills of Toehider. Simone Simons of Epica. Paul Gilbert, formerly of Racer X and Mr. Big. And even Tobias Sammet of the symphonic metal super project Avantasia that I covered last year, who the musical press has loved to paint as a rival to Arjen before they buried the hatchet back in 2008, but still, that's a collaboration I wanted to see. I haven't seen a murderous row of talent this loaded since, shit, maybe Dave Cobb brought together Southern Family last year, and that was a 10 out of 10 album. But The Source, it was promising more than that. A prequel record to the acclaimed 01-011-001 from 2008, telling the haunting story behind the collapse of the civilization behind the mysterious Forevers, who has always lurked behind so much of Ayreon's narrative. So, on the one hand, it made plenty of sense for Arjen to cast the record with so many artists that he's already worked with before in order to deepen some thematic parallels. Or, from what I could tell, maybe even play the same character again, like with Hansi Kirsch and Floor Jansen. But on the other hand, prequels are always a really dangerous proposition, especially in a universe like Ayreon's with 9 albums stuffed full of interweaving continuity, with time travel to boot. But as always, my expectations going in were incredibly high. I trust Arjen that much, especially with buzz suggesting this could very well be Ayreon's best album since The Human Equation. So, okay, does it live up to my extremely high expectations? Well, if I'm being brutally honest, this was a much harder review to write than I expected. My dearest hope is that I could come here, sit down, say the album's awesome, Arjen's done it again, go out and buy it, you should, and then spend the next 10 or so minutes gushing over it and nitpicking whatever scant flaws I can find. But the more I went through The Source, the more I couldn't overlook some very real issues that I can't in good conscience now excuse. And that's a frustrating thing, because when it comes to the actual music on this album, the production, the instrumentation, the composition, the all-star vocal cast, Ayreon just knocks it out of the park yet again. And I can even say I can get behind a lot of the thematic arc and ideas behind this album. But there's no way around the structural problems and some of the writing that makes this record a lot harder for me to like as much as I wanted to. And believe it or not, they aren't entirely prequel problems either. They probably would have existed regardless. And yeah, it is great. I will give Ayreon this, but man, I wanted to like this more, wanted to say it was one of the best of the year, and I can't say that. And believe me, if I could overlook these issues, I would, because when you consider the production and compositions on display here, this is easily one of Ayreon's heaviest and most explosive records in years, up there with Flight of the Migrator and 01-011-001. And given that it's a direct prequel to the latter, if you liked a lot of the melodies and tones that ran through that album, and I do, this record will certainly satisfy you. The gargantuan swells of frigid synth and mechanical percussion that anchor the roars of guitar and the heavier bass grooves, all interspersed with some of the richest folk and hard rock instrumentation Ayreon has ever brought in without recruiting Troy Donaclay. Strings, flutes, tin whistles, Hammond organ, they are all here and they sound fantastic. Yeah, while there is a part of me that was a little bit reticent to hear some of those drum machines that did manage to creep in against some of the drums, Ayreon, he always manages to have them interlocking with the other mechanical elements that they never sound distracting or out of place in the mix here. And they're used to in pretty amazing effect in cranking up the tempos and grooves to some of the most aggressive in Ayreon's entire discography, and yeah, I can get behind that. Now granted, there are definitely points where I think the instrumental should be a fair bit darker in the production in order to match some of the content. All the major chords and bright keyboards on Everybody Dies, it's a little bit discombobulating, even if the melodic hook is pretty impressive, especially if you remember how dark songs like The Sixth Extinction managed to get. Even if it does kind of match a certain point of view in the apocalypse and process, I kind of get why he went in this direction, but still, didn't quite work. But still, more often than not, you get some stellar instrumental moments. I love the primary melody behind Sea of Machines and the strings, and the sharper acoustic groove on Condemned to Live. The fiddles and the acoustics play off the solid bass groove and all that was. There were even hints of psychedelic funk on the opening track, The Day the World Breaks Down, that I haven't heard from Ayreon in years. It was a great callback. The sheer guitar-driven aggression on Run Apocalypse Run, Into the Ocean, and Planet Y is Alive, it's pretty damn effective. And as much as I think the hooks can feel a little bit shrill in the vocals, I do think Aquatic Race and Journey to Forever have some ridiculously strong hooks all the same. And yeah, you can bet that I really enjoyed the tonal callbacks to 01, 011, 001, from the strings on Condemned to Live to the blur of synth and strings on The Source Will Flow. But on the other hand, for as much as I like that Ayreon did experiment a little bit in terms of composition and tightening up the tempo, I really was not wild about the Arabic portion that was juxtaposed against the opera vocals on Deathcry of a Race. Sure, the opening of that song is really potent, but that little piece felt gratuitous and oddly a little out of place. Now granted, if you're going into an Ayreon record, you can expect some excess in the vocals, and yeah, The Source, it definitely delivers. And look, I could go on about how Floor Jansen brings some of the greatest intensity of her entire career, really impressive, and that Tommy Karavik arguably drives the core of this album, or how Mike Mills again subtly steals the show and deserves a lot more acclaim, but we all knew the talent was here going in. If I was gonna nitpick, it would come in a few places. For one, as much as versatility as Tommy Rogers shows as his role, there's part of me that wishes that he'd actually used a little bit more of the growled vocals that he uses in Between the Buried and Me. But really, that's symptomatic of how many of these vocal arrangements could have used a little bit more meat in the low end, a few more heavier baritones to balance everything out, if only for just a little bit of modulation. Granted, this also ties back to the writing, because the instrumentation does take its time to ease back. It does have some of those quieter moments, and yet more often than not, I find myself wishing that the singers other than James LaBrie got the space to actually ease back themselves. This is a record that often requires that everybody be at full volume consistently, and you find yourself cherishing the quieter moments to savor the melancholy or subtly crank up some of the tension, which is kind of bizarre considering that as an 88-minute double album, you would think there would be enough space there for you to actually have those moments, that you would want some of that balance. But okay. I've danced around the issue long enough. Let's talk about the story on this album and the lyrics and themes. And again, it's not exactly the themes or ideas or even some of the details where I find an issue, as Ayreon is telling the tale of how these near-immortal and emotionally disconnected forevers that crop up all around the Ayreon universe were first created. They were once human, fleeing a planet that they themselves destroyed when they turned over all responsibility to machines in order to fix things, landing on a primarily aquatic planet and taking a chemical in order to adapt to that environment, only to inevitably succumb to machine dependence yet again. And let me stress that I'm willing to excuse a lot here. How Sea Machines references modern human technology despite being a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. How the writing might lean a little bit too heavily on established Ayreon iconography as a prequel. Even if I appreciate the shoutouts, not everyone will have heard Flight of the Navigator or Into the Electric Castle. Or how when you dig into the subtext, this album is saying a lot about human hubris, short-term thinking and repeating the same damn mistakes over and over again, especially actually understanding some of the consequences, which would become an issue on 01, 011, 001. All the more blatant when you consider how much of that sequel album that this record subtly mirrors, including the desperate, ambiguous hope at the ending that somehow humanity will find their vibrant emotional core and not be pacified by drugs, technology, or just the process of time. But it's where we have to start talking about the plot of this album, not the themes, the actual mechanics here, and the biggest main issue, the conflict. Namely, that there isn't much of it at all, especially between the various characters. And when you consider the stakes of this album, there really should be. For starters, beginning the album in medias res as the machines start their takeover, it might be an exciting way to start things off, but it sets up the whole "I told you so" moment between the world's opposition leader and the president. It sets it up way too early to reflect a conflict between them. They're now forced to unite because they got no choice, they gotta do it for survival. And then you have their plan to find a ship and flee, which sets up the fact that these people, they're leaving a world full of friends and family behind to die in the coming societal breakdown, the robot apocalypse. And yet, all the cast winds up on the ship? I mean, sure, All That Was and Condemned to Live references the loss of the rest of their race, but you don't get a sense of the angst or the lingering consequences of this act from any of the cast on the rest of the project. They might mention it when they're singing, but not to a point of impacting the narrative or any one character's choice, and that sort of societal trauma, that would resonate for a lot of people. Because again, then they all take the source, otherwise referenced as Liquid Eternity for another callback, in order to live underwater on that new planet Sierra and become immortal and telepathically linked, but there's nobody speaking out against the loss of self or the greater consequences until it's too late. And furthermore, not only why is this president still allowed on board despite what he did on the original planet, but why is he allowed to bring another robot on board without any serious question that this robot might not turn on them? These are some obvious sources of conflict, questioning the collective mind against the individual on a thematic level. And yet the truth is that many of these characters on this record don't feel like individuals in their writing, and a lack of greater diversity in the vocals from higher belting tenors doesn't really help this. And this is where tension becomes a factor. Given that this album is a prequel, you need to heighten the tension and tragedy by showing someone with the foresight to question here, or show these forevers facing the consequences of their actions, because we already know what happens in the end. But again, it's reckless hubris, and you really can't identify with an arc where history is going to repeat itself yet again, especially if you have heard that sequel album. Now, some of you might argue that this kind of was also the case with the tension-losing elements on 01, 011, 001, but the difference there comes in the fact that despite the Forever's doomed mission to Earth, we got snapshots back to the planet to show exactly what was at stake here on Earth. Yeah, it was kind of heavy-handed in some of the socio-political commentary, but it showed there were consequences. This, for as long as this record was, there really is no excuse to not to flesh out more of these characters, make them more distinct and unique beyond just the voices. And if your point was to show humanity doesn't change with our reliance on drugs or technology, and can brush aside tragedy when confronted with an escape, well, okay, I can get behind the theme, but I still think the story could have been better told on a structural level to engage with some human drama and draw the audience in, which is one reason why I praise the human equation and the theory of everything so damn much. They managed to get that human connection. Look, I don't want to say this album is bad, because it's not. From a compositional point of view, when you factor in the delivery and the production, Ayreon sets one of the highest standards in progressive metal in the industry, hell, and musical together. But for the cast that they have, and the fact that I am such an easy sell for this, I wish I connected with this story on an emotional level a lot more. As such, I'm giving this an 8 out of 10, and a recommendation for Ayreon fans, and really any fan of progressive metal, and I really am praying that the composition is growing me enough that I can ignore the story issues more. But as it is, look, it is Ayreon, and while I would not put this among Arian's best, it is still worth your time, so yeah, make sure to check this out. It's worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I know this review went on long, but I had a lot to say. This is a pretty dense record, and I've got a long history with Ayreon. Beyond that, if you guys want to buy this record, and I do think you should, it is good. Actually, it is really kind of great. I think you should check it out. Links in the description below. And I got the poll up here. I'm really curious where Ayreon fans fall on this. I know a lot of people have praised it, but I'm curious whether or not my opinion sways anybody's mind. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once per week you guys get to add records to my schedule if you're in the higher tiers. More details right there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.